Last week I left off the share with a very unusual question, and the question that we said last week is a really strange one. And what we said was that the Mashiach, one of the functions of Mashiach, the main function of Mashiach, we have said, is to bring down a certain light of Torah, to reveal a light which has never been revealed, to reveal an understanding of Torah which has never been understood in that way. That's the essence of the Mashiach. And there is a difference between the Mashiach ben Yosef and the Mashiach ben David with respect to these two things. The function of the Mashiach ben Yosef, as we've said, the function of the Mashiach ben Yosef is Tahara. And as we've said, when Klal Yisrael sins, the most critical aspect, which is the most critical thing which is affected by their sins, is the level of the Torah that they are privy to. The Torah has many levels, and the levels that the Torah has vary with respect to how much it is revealed and how much it is hidden. The concept of Hester and Giloi. When Klal Yisrael is in a high state, in a state of Tikkun, a high state, then the Torah, which they are privy to, is in a state of Gilui Yehudo, where it's Magala, where it reveals the oneness of the Shalom. The light is a clear light, so then one can see, as one reads it, the existence of the Shalom and an understanding of its ways. But when Klal Yisrael is in a state of Kilkul, you see, then we're dealing with a concept called Hester Yehudo, which means that the Torah then conceals the absolute existence of God from its from its innermost aspects. And therefore, whether Klal Yisrael is merit or is zocher to a Torah which reveals the clear existence of God, or whether it does not, depends on the status of Klal Yisrael, of the Jews. This is essentially the thing. Now, the more Klal Yisrael sins, then the darker the Torah gets. And this is the greatest onus of Klal Yisrael. The greatest punishment that they get is the fact that God withdraws and does not allow them to see clearly who He is or that He is. The reward of Klal Yisrael is when God comes back, you see, returns, and then Klal Yisrael is able to see clearly who God is and the nature of His yichud, and that constitutes their simcha. The whole essence of Olam Haba is nothing more than Klal Yisrael, the Jews, the neshamas of Klal Yisrael, and the state that they'll be in, with the ability to perceive the true existence and oneness of God. And this is Olam Haba. This is what's called Hasagas Yehudo, or the perception of His unity, is the essence of Olam Haba, and is the essence of the simcha of what will be in Olam Haba. And in Olam Hazeh, this awareness is already compromised because of a state of chasson or inadequacy. When Klal Yisrael sins, it is further compromised into a state called kilkul. Now, there's a function of Mashiach ben Yosef, specifically, to undo the damage that Klal Yisrael did. It's the function of each Jew to undo his own damage. But it's the function of Mashiach ben Yosef, essentially, to assist Klal Yisrael in undoing their damage, to purify Klal Yisrael, and to climax that activity called Tahara. That's his basic function. Therefore, it is the Mashiach ben Yosef whose essential function is to go and retrieve the original light of what the Torah is. That's why Moshe Rabbeinu was the model of what a Mashiach ben Yosef is. Because Moshe Rabbeinu, when he went up to the heavens, when he went up to the Shemayim to receive the Torah, that Torah which he was receiving was a Torah which was newly freed from the damage that the world had done to it from the time of Adam until that point. And it was Moshe's function to go and to retrieve what that Torah is. As we said before, Moshe was supposed to bring down the light of the Mashiach itself. He failed to do it because of the fact that Klal Yisrael transgressed on the sin of the golden calf and the hate of the ego. So this essentially is what happened. So the basic function of the Mashiach, and don't let anyone tell you different, because it is not true, the essential function of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to reveal the Torah in its pristine, pure form. as it exists when it is not in a damaged state. It is a function of the Mashiach ben David to take that Torah which has already been revealed by the Mashiach ben Yosef and elevate it to the highest level right before Olam Haba. You see, to elevate it to the highest level of what? Of revelation. That's the function of Mashiach ben David. But in that way, they both differ. But they are both identical in the fact that their chief function is to bring down a new light. Like it says, O Chodesh al Sion To'ir. A new light will come down to Zion. That's what it says, and that's it. It's an Or Chodesh. The Or Chodesh, this new light, this Messianic light, this new Torah, so to speak. It's not really a new Torah, but it's a Torah which no longer hides its interior. The Torah that we have now has an exterior which conceals its interior. Because of that, when you look in the Torah, when you read it, you cannot see the true existence of God or the real ways of God. But there will come a time when there will be a new light which will reveal the interior, because the exterior will become like glass, so that instantly you'll be able to see the inner depth of what the Torah is itself. And that, in essence, is what's called the new light, the Or Chodesh, and that light is revealed by both Mashiachs, and that's their main function. Except that the Mashiach ben Yosef reveals the light which is damaged or concealed because of the sins of the Jews, and the Mashiach ben David reveals the light which has never come down. You see, a light which we are all waiting for, which is the essence of Olam Haba. Now, I've gone into this topic many times, and I do not want to go into it again, about the relationship of the Mashiach to the light and so on, to his light. What I'd like to discuss tonight is something which is very unusual, and it's very little known. Another part of the Mashiach ben Yosef, another part of his job, which is very fundamental. And in order to really explain that, we have to go into very deep things. The function of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to bring a cure or a refuah shlema to the Satan himself. That is one of the critical aspects of the Mashiach ben Yosef. You see, it's the same thing as the fact that he's supposed to reveal the Torah, a new Torah, and take it out of the depths of darkness. You see, we could say that same statement another way, that his ability to take out the Torah from the depths of darkness is identical with the fact that at the same moment he gives a cure, or he completely rehabilitates or redeems the Satan himself. Now, what am I talking about? What exactly does he mean? Does that mean? That sounds like a very strange concept. Okay, in order to understand that, we have to go back to the time of Adam Rishon to get a clear insight. But even more so, we have to go back even before that time to understand the ways of God. Now, I've already began a little bit speaking about that, but we have to do this a little more specifically. Let's go back now to the sin of Adam Rishon, and let's see what happened there, and let's recount the story. First of all, what you see basically is the following. Adam Rishon was told by the Baruch Hashem not to eat from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. Clear, understood fact. His wife was informed basically of the same thing, and together they both were clearly given the commandment, a lo seseh, or a negative commandment, not to eat of the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Okay, what happened? The Nachash, the snake, came over to Chava and started talking to her. Now, the question is, what does that mean, a snake talks? Well, let's put that aside for a minute. The snake started talking to Chava and attempted to seduce her to eat from the Eitz Hadas Tov Ra. That's what it is. The Nachash, what's called the primordial Nachash, or the Nachash HaKadmoni, that's the Nachash at the time of Adam. Nachash HaKadmoni, the primordial Nachash, means the first Nachash. Okay, succeeded. Nachash HaKadmoni succeeded, right, in convincing Chava that she should eat of it. She ate of it, and she gave it to Adam. They both ate, and that was the end of the matter. The Baruch Hashem then dealt with Adam and Chava the consequences, and essentially what it says there, that he cursed them. He cursed Adam, he cursed Chava, and he also cursed the Nachash. He told Adam that he will die, and from now on he has to, by the sweat of his brow, he has to be able to feed himself and so on. Chava was cursed with other things, with labor pains and so on, and then he turned around to the Nachash, the Baruch Hashem turned around to the Nachash, and he cursed the Nachash. And he said, from now on, you will have no feet, from now on you will eat of the dust of the earth. You see, you will eat of the dust of the earth, and you will no longer walk on the earth, but you will crawl on your belly, and you and man will be total enemies. Now, there's a very interesting thing is, what exactly happened over there, and why did God curse the Nachash? Well, who was the Nachash? Who was this snake? The answer is, this snake, this Nachash, was a true serpent, you see, but this Nachash essentially had the full power of the Satan in him. Now, exactly, what is the Satan? Who is the Satan? The Satan is an angel. It is an angel. The Satan is an angel. He's called the Satan because the word Satan means to accuse. And essentially, he was given 3 jobs. The Baruch Hashem says, I will create this world. I'm creating my world on the basis of justice, and not on the basis of chesed, or on the basis of simply loving kindness. What does it mean? The Baruch Hashem says that I want man to earn his olam haba, based not on the fact that I will give it to him as a gift, but based on the fact that he will earn it as a reward. That's a very different concept. But the Baruch Hashem said, even though I create the world to give good to man, and to give him a place in olam haba, which is eternal, essentially I am not going to give it to him as a gift, without him doing anything about it, but I'm going to give it to him in such a way where he must earn it. That's called mishpat. God created the world in mishpat, with justice, not with chesed. If God had created the world only with chesed, chesed means a loving kindness. It means simply you do something for someone else without anything in return. It is unconditional. So he would have given man olam haba unconditionally. Instead, God said, I will give you olam haba conditionally. Means depending on what you do. If you earn it, you will have it. If you do not earn it, you will lose it. That's called justice. Justice means whatever you do, you are the cause of your own consequences. That's the concept of din, or mishpat. Okay? So the world is not run on chesed alone, right? But rather, the world exists through mishpat. So mishpat defines chesed conditionally. Who represents Mishpat in the world? Mishpat is represented, or the world itself is represented by many Malachim. Malachim are spiritual beings who perform the essential operations or processes connected with all existence. And the essential Malach, the Malach, who is in charge, basically, of performing the essential process called Mishpat, his name is the Satan. He has another name. You see, he has other names, but his main name is, he has other names in Kabbalah and so on, but his name, as we know him, is the Satan. And he has 3 functions, 3 jobs. 1, the Baruch Hashem says, I appoint you to do 3 jobs. You are in charge of seeing to it that man cannot get into olam haba unless he will have earned it. It's your job. You're the caretaker of din. And because of that, you have 3 functions. 1, it is your job to seduce man. You got to go over and tempt him away from me. Try and give him an alternative to me. Number 2, if you find that he sins, it is your job to come and inform me. Not that the Baruch Hashem says, not that I don't know, but it's your job to what? To involve yourself or occupy yourself with a judicial statement and come before the heavenly court and accuse that man. So therefore, not only you are a seducer, but you are the accusing angel. You are a prosecuting attorney. And finally, if we find that your prosecution is correct, then it is your job to go down and execute this man according to the law. It is your job to prevent this man from ever getting his olam haba. You are the ultimate annihilator. So therefore, the Satan has these 3 jobs. You are the seducer, you are the prosecutor, and you are the annihilator. All rolled into one. You represent din. Now, as such, this Satan was a malach. Now, a malach is a very holy being because the nature of existence is very, very high. And the Satan as a malach is a malach just like every other malach. For example, there are other malachim with names, Michael, or in English, Michael, Gabriel. These are all malachim who are very great. Very, very high. There are higher malachim than them. There's a high malach, Sandal, and there's another one, Metat, who's the highest one of all. They're all very great, but Satan is like among the tops of them all. And as such, he has tremendous kedusha associated with himself. Just like any other malach. Very, very holy. So the Baruch says, I have this job for you. So this doesn't change the Satan either. The Satan is fine. This is the job. This is a holy job. The Satan is not an evil malach. It's not as evil. His job is simply to see to it that man earns olam haba by virtue of his efforts. That's all. We usually think of the Satan as evil. He's not evil. He is a very holy malach who has a specific job. Okay. That's facing the thing. Now, The Satan, in order to seduce man, doesn't come to man directly, because the Satan himself is a malach. He cannot relate to a human being. So therefore, what the Satan does is to infuse his power, or the power of seduction, into a representative, or into a physical representative. That physical representative is a nachash. The nachash, who is an animal, a snake, is given the power of speech, and essentially he represents the satanic objective of seducing man. Not of destroying him, of seducing man, so that man can then defy the seduction, and by so doing earn olam haba. So the nachash is the tempter, or the seducer, who represents the power of the Satan to do it. And that's why the nachash opposed Chava. The nachash opposed Chava, because that's essentially his internal nature. The power of the Satan is invested in the nachash, and the nachash feels it in his consciousness, or in his being. And he feels it by virtue of his own nature, that he knows that what he has to do, what will make him happy, is to try and seduce Adam and Chava. He feels that in terms of his own being. Now, does the nachash have free will? Of course not. No one has free will. Only man has free will, because only man is given the choice of either earning or losing olam haba. The nachash has no free will. The nachash is simply the agent, if I may call him, he's an agent for the Satan. He is a physical incarnation, so to speak, of the power of the Satan to seduce. And he feels that internally as his own nature. He doesn't have any free will. He can no more defy his own nature as you can defy your nature to breathe. So therefore, the nachash went over to Chava and to Adam. It tried Adam first, didn't succeed. Chava, and was successful. Because the nachash did what he essentially felt was his basic, the raison d'etre, or the reason for his own existence. When Adam did sin, the Baruch Hashem turned around and cursed Adam and Chava. That's understandable, because Adam has free will. He didn't have to listen to the nachash. We find a very bizarre thing. The Baruch Hashem turned around and cursed the nachash. He said, because you have seduced Adam and Chava, I'm going to curse you. You will no longer have to eat from the dust of the ground. You will slither on the ground, you see. You crawl on your belly. You will be at war with man. And essentially, this is a terrible thing to do. And this is what happened to nachash. The nachash was cursed, and this is essentially what the basic thing that happened. Transformation of the nachash. The nachash was transformed, you see, into a terrible being because of what he did to Adam and Chava. Now what's the obvious question?
Why?
That's rhetorical. The obvious question is what? Is why was the nachash punished if he doesn't have any free will? If that's his job, why is he punished? The Satan wasn't punished as such. That's his job. The Baruch Hashem wants that job. That's the holiest job of all. You see, it's the holiest job of all, because the Baruch Hashem says, I want man to do it on his own. I don't want to give him any gift. It's the Baruch Hashem said that. The Baruch Hashem said, what? That I will build my world on mishpat, on justice, and not chesed. My world is conditional. It is not unconditional. So therefore the Baruch Hashem assigned this to the Satan and says, you have the holiest task in creation. You are the gatekeeper. It is up to you who gets by into olam haba or not. And suddenly the Baruch Hashem turns around, and when the gatekeeper is very successful in the seduction, the Baruch Hashem turns around and curses the nachash, who simply did what? He did follow the instructions of his internal, his internal essence. Why did the Baruch Hashem curse the nachash? Very, very difficult question to answer, you see. But the answer to that question lies the deepest process in all creation. The nachash had to be cursed. Because if the nachash wasn't cursed, all existence as we know it would have been annihilated instantly. What am I talking about? That is the ultimate purpose of the Mashiach ben Yosef. It is the job of the Mashiach ben Yosef to undo the curse of the nachash. That's his job. What curse? To undo the damage of the nachash. Okay. Now, the damage of the nachash is referred to in a certain way. The damage of the nachash is referred to the zohama shel nachash. That's the way Chazal said. I've said this word a number of times. Zohama shel nachash. The zohama of the nachash. And zohama means, what zohama means is something polluted, contaminated, or something which is defiled. The Zom of the Nachash is something, what the Nachash did to mankind. Because because Adam listed the Nachash, he became contaminated. In fact, what the Gemara says, a very interesting thing, Hitul bo Zoyama. When Chava did the Chet, it says that the Nachash spit or projected a Zom or a contaminated substance into Chava. That's what it says. Now, in a figurative sense, this is referred to as a sexual activity, only figuratively. You see, in a literal sense, this really means a spiritual damage that was done to Chava. That's what it means, and that's what he said. Hitul bo Zoyama. The Nachash projected a contamination or a contaminated substance into Chava, into Adam, and into all of existence. That's what it says. When the Nachash did that, he damaged all of existence by bringing it into a state of kilkul, or damage. It is the job of every Jew to undo that contamination, or to metaher, or purify that dharma. It is finally the job of the Mashiach ben Yosef to totally undo that damage. When that damage is undone, when that kilkul is removed, then the Nachash is cured. The Nachash is cured, you see. So in essence, the Nachash projected this contamination because the Nachash, at that point, became damaged. That's what damaged the Nachash itself. Now the interesting thing is that, as I'm saying, the essential function of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to redeem the Nachash himself. That's why, as I've said before, the gematria, or the numerical value of Mashiach, right, is 358, is equivalent to the numerical value of Nachash, also 358. Because the function of the Mashiach ben Yosef, is to redeem or to rehabilitate the seductive, the Nachash. But when I say that the Mashiach ben Yosef is supposed to redeem the Nachash, I mean the Zohar of the Nachash, the contamination which is projected out into the world. That's what the Mashiach ben Yosef has to undo. The Mashiach ben David has to undo the whole Nachash, period. The Mashiach ben Yosef, as I said before, has to undo the damage of the Nachash, but not the Nachash himself. The ability of the Nachash to seduce, the power of the Satan to represent a seductive force, remains even after the Mashiach ben Yosef. What the Mashiach ben Yosef simply does is undo the damage of Adam and all of mankind when they had listened to the Nachash. That's what he cures. It is the job of the Mashiach ben David to remove completely the ability of the Nachash to seduce. Totally. So that once the Mashiach ben David enters the scene, after a period of time, the Nachash entirely disappears. Completely. And there is no more seductive force in the world. There is no more satanic force in the world. Because it is the Mashiach ben David who will destroy or completely remove the whole concept of the Satan. And what will happen is there will be no more seducer, there will be no more accuser, and there will be no more an executor. All these functions will be totally destroyed by the Mashiach ben David. So the Mashiach ben David deals with the elemental satanic seduction itself. The Mashiach ben Yosef deals with the damage or the consequence of listening to this satanic seduction. Thus we find that the Nachash has two stages. The Nachash has the first stage, when it simply represents the satanic seduction. You see, that's called Nachash. And it has a second stage, which is called the Zohar of the Nachash. Zohar shel Nachash of the Nachash. That's the second stage. That's the Nachash succeeding in doing what it does. The Mashiach ben Yosef counteracts the Zohar of the Nachash, and the Mashiach ben David counteracts the Nachash itself. Let me just deal with this question over here, and we have to understand this basic concept. It has to do with the structure of Olam Haba. When the Rebbe says, I want to create a person, one person, And if that person listens to the mitzvah that I give him, he will earn Olam Haba. Olam Haba has a certain amount of quantity and quality. It has a quantitative and qualitative feature. You see, let's say, for example, that Olam Haba represents 300 tons of simcha. So what the Baruch Shem says, in order for you to accumulate these 300 tons of simcha, you have to do a certain amount of activity. Okay. So what the Baruch Shem said to Adam Rishon is, you have to adhere to my mitzvah for a certain period of time. And if you do that, you will earn the 300 tons. Now Adam failed to do that. Because he failed to do that, he lost the ability and had to go through it a different way. But the fact is that even though mankind has been struggling to go back to where it was before, to do what Adam should have done, we have to do a certain amount of activity to earn the 300 tons in Olam Haba. Even after the Mashiach ben Yosef arrives, when the Mashiach ben Yosef arrives, mankind as a totality, who now does collectively what Adam did as an individual, will only do, by the time the Mashiach ben Yosef arrives and the Geula is here, when suddenly the Mashiach arrives and all the Jews go back to Israel, right, we will have achieved 295 tons. He will come not when we will achieve the last amount, but only when we achieve almost to the end. But there's still a certain amount of work left to do. You see, that last piece of work that has to be done essentially will be supervised by the Mashiach ben David. That's why the Nachash still lives. That's why the ability to do a chet still exists after the Mashiach ben David arrives. Except that because of the fact that there's so small, so little left to be done, the ability of the Satan to seduce will be extremely small. Now you may ask the question, and the question that is being asked, which is a very important one, fine. So let's say that's very small, but the fact is that we still will have the ability to fall. And if we have the ability to fall, why should we avoid the consequence of what happened with Adam? We saw what happened when Adam fell. Adam fell, and look what happened. The Jews fell with the chet of the Egel, and look what happened. So even after the Mashiach ben David comes, what will guarantee us so that if we do sins, we will not fall back again, all the way back to where we were before? Okay. The answer to this is that this exactly is the promise of the Baruch Shem to Avom and the Klal Yisrael with respect to the Mashiach, the time of Mashiach. What the Baruch Shem says is the following, that once the Mashiach arrives, once the Mashiach ben Yosef arrives, and the Mashiach ben David comes, it is no longer possible to ever go back before the Mashiach time. You see, now, even though you can sin after, in a very small way, but the nature of those sins will no longer have the power to bring us back like it did with the Jews when they left Egypt by the chet of the Egel and with Adam Rishon. Because it has to do with the qualitative and quantitative change of what a mitzvah is before the Mashiach comes and after the Mashiach comes. Before the Mashiach comes, a mitzvah has a certain type of qualitative aspects in such a way that if we fail to do it or we transgress it, we have the ability to incur serious damage. So therefore we can constantly block the Mashiach from coming. But once the Mashiach arrives, and he truly arrives, what the Baruch Shem says is that you no longer have the ability to do that, even with the small sins that you have left. Because it is the nature of those mitzvahs that will not lend themselves to that kind of transgression, the kind of transgression which will damage like the original transgression did. You see what I'm saying? That's the answer. Now why that is a very, very deep thing. You see, it's very deep. Why the mitzvah after the Mashiach comes will not have the ability anymore in its transgression to damage mankind as it did before. But that's the haftacha, that's the promise that the Baruch Shem gave to Klal Yisrael. You see, in other words, the Messianic period will be very different. It will involve, you see, a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer Tov. It will have an evil inclination and a good inclination. It still will have. Because it needs to, because the full amount of work that has to be done to earn Olam Haba will not have finished, even after the Mashiach comes. The job that we have to do to earn Olam Haba will finish by the year 6000. That's what the Baruch Shem says. From the time of Adam until the end of that job is 6,000 years. And it cannot go any further. Which means that the Baruch Shem says, I will see to it, basically, that mankind must complete the job and earn the full 300 tons, so to speak, of Olam Haba by the year 6000. So therefore, after the year 6000, a Yetzer Hara is no longer needed, a Satan is no longer needed, because the Baruch Shem doesn't need that kind of work to build Olam Haba. It already will have been accomplished. But the Mashiach comes before the year 6000. Whatever it is. If the Mashiach comes this year, it means we still have 252 years left before the year 6000. So Klal Yisrael has to go through another 252 years of observing mitzvahs. But since once Mashiach comes, the nature of the world changes, and people will recognize God in a very spontaneous way, the ability to do a mitzvah will shrink to a very, very small level. That's why there are no more Baal Tshuva when the Mashiach comes. Because anyone will be a Baal Tshuva automatically. There are no more converts, because the entire world will understand and know the Baruch Shalom. But there still will be very, very small amount of mitzvahs left, in some way. And that's enough to finish off the job. But that type of mitzvah will not be able to cause the damage that the mitzvah did in their transgression before the Mashiach arrives. Okay, now we have to understand this point. So therefore we see that the Nachash exists in two stages. The first stage is in his original stage, where he's a seducer, a prosecutor and annihilator, and in the second stage, which is called the Zohamah, you see, of the Nachash. Now, what the Mashiach ben Yosef has to do is to undo this Zohamah shel Nachash, and Mashiach ben David will undo the Nachash itself. And I think I've been pretty clear in terms of the function of both with the two Mashiachs with respect to both of these prophecies. Now, why is this going on? Why does the Mashiach ben Yosef essentially have to do here, and what does all this have to do with the curse of Chava? Okay, this is a very, very important thing, and it has to do with the fundamental concept of the way God created the world. We have just said that the Baruch Shalom did not create the world through Chesed alone. Right? He did not create it through Chesed, because then he would have simply given man Olam Haba. Chesed became conditional, which means that Chesed now has to be mediated through Mishpat. Okay? Mishpat is now essentially the guiding principle of the world. But the question remains, what happens if a person sins? What's the job of the Sultan if a person sins? Annihilation. So when Adam sinned, what the Sultan should have done is come down. As soon as he attempted to seduce Adam through the Nachash. Once Adam sinned and Chava sinned, he ran up to the Bezdin Shemala, to the heavenly court, and said, you see they sinned. I accuse Adam of sinning. It was found to be true, and then Baruch Shalom said to Nachash, to the Sultan, okay, now go down and execute the law. So the Sultan's job is to go down to annihilate Adam. But the Baruch Shalom doesn't want Adam annihilated, because the Baruch Shalom created Adam to be an Olam Haba. That's what the Baruch Shalom wants. He's a mative. He wants to do good to Adam. You see. But at the same time, he has given the ability of Adam to destroy himself. So therefore, how can we reconcile God's will with Adam's free will? Or God's desire with Adam's free will? God has a desire for Adam to go into Olam Haba. Adam has the free will to destroy himself. The two are somewhat irreconcilable, aren't they? Big problem. So therefore, what the Baruch Shalom then does is do something which is very, very important, and that's called yichud, or mercy, called rachamim. What exactly is rachamim? Rachamim is mercy. But the essential function of mercy is to suspend the ability of mishpat to destroy mankind. The function of rachamim, which is mercy, the function of rachamim, which is mercy, is in essence like this. God is not merciful. Now that sounds like some kind of strange statement. God is not merciful. We think that God is merciful, so therefore what we do, God extends mercy. Mercy doesn't mean that the Baruch Shalom says, I forgive and I forget. That's not really what it's about. God is a maschased. God has what's called chesed, or loving kindness. That's what God does. The Baruch Shalom wants to give you Olam Haba. That's essentially, the Baruch Shalom has a desire, not intrinsically, but we see God as if He had a desire to do good for us. Therefore, God is beneficent. But that beneficence is conditional. Mishpat. The problem with Mishpat is that it allows the possibility of man to destroy himself. So the question is, what happens to God's beneficence? So what the Baruch Shalom then introduces is a way to essentially remove the annihilative property of Mishpat, which means that the Baruch Shalom allows the Satan to seduce man. He allows the Satan to prosecute. But then when the Satan runs up to annihilate man, he says you can't do that. You can only punish him. You can only cause him pain. You can only kill him in terms of death. But you cannot go down and annihilate his soul. I will not allow that. You cannot remove him from existence. You see, you can do other things which will cause him pain and suffering and so on, but not annihilation. So what the Banishim has done is essentially to suspend the annihilative role of the Satan. This is the essence of the matter. That suspension of the annihilative role is called Rachamim. It's a whole different way to think about it. That's in essence what it is. That's called Rachamim or Yichud. But wait, how does the Banishim do that? It's no easy trick. 1 second. What is it? The right hand and the left hand are at war? 1 second. The Satan comes up to the Banishim and says, wait, hold on a minute. Hold on. You gave me a job. When I interviewed for this job, right, you said to me that the following is what I have to do. I have to seduce. Good. I have to prosecute. Great. And if I'm successful, I annihilate. So what are you throwing me a cup now and you're not letting me do my job? Make up your mind. Is it conditional or is it not? This is a big problem. Because the Banishim, when the Banishim says, I don't want you to annihilate, the Satan turns around and says, where do you come off telling me this? You told me to do that. That's my job. That is the most powerful problem in creation. The most important problem in all of creation is the problem that I have just described. What does the Banishim do with Mishpat? When Mishpat makes its demands. Now, where does Mishpat come from? From the Banishim himself. So let we say to Banishim, make up your mind. One way or the other, you got to make up your mind. And that's essentially what the problem really is. So in order to deal with that, what happens is the Banishim has to do something to the agent of Mishpat. Who is the agent of Mishpat? The agent of Mishpat is the Satan. So therefore, the Banishim has to do something to that angel, so that that angel does not go up and attempt to annihilate. This is the critical problem of Rachamim. What does the Banishim do to the Satan? Now I'm going to describe what he does to the Satan. It is a very, very strange process what he does to the Satan. Okay? We will not go into the inner depth of what he does or explain why he specifically does that. What is the objective here? The Banishim has to see to it that the Satan does not annihilate. In order to do that, when man fails, what the Banishim then has to do is blind the Satan so that he loses ability to annihilate. Now, listen very carefully and you will understand the essential process of what's done. How does the Satan annihilate a person? Where does he get the ability to do that? Where does he get the power to do that? Where does the Satan get the ability to annihilate people? How? Because essentially it has to do with the ultimate purpose of creation. The Banishim said to man, I want you to create Olam Haba. Where is Olam Haba? The answer is Olam Haba is Olam Hazeh, transformed. I'm going to put you into a physical existence, and because you're in a physical existence, you will not be able to access spirituality. It is your job to undo or to transform physical substance so that suddenly you will be able to access spirituality, and that will be your Olam Haba. Remember, that's called Zichor, or the purification of physicality. A very important concept. But that's what the Banishim says. I'm going to put you into a prison, and in that prison you will not be able to see who I am, and therefore not have a simcha in Olam Haba. But you can destroy your own prison. I'm not going to do it for you. I'm not going to come down and take you out of prison. I'm going to give you a ray gun, you see. And if you do certain things, suddenly that ray gun will have power, and you will point it at the door and at the prison, and suddenly the prison will suddenly, all around you, disappear. That's what it is. That's what the Banishim says. And that's what the Banishim said to Adam. I will give you a certain kedusha, or a certain power, and that power will enter into your neshama if you follow my mitzvah. And at that moment, you will suddenly transform all physical reality, so that physical reality will no longer be a barrier to seeing me and to being aware of spirituality. If you remember, that was called Zichor HaGuf, or the purification of the Guf. That's the magic. The magic is that Adam Rishon was given the ability to transform his own prison and free himself. Whereas initially the physical substance constituted a barrier between man and God, no longer will be a barrier because it will be completely removed like glass. And man has that ability. So therefore man has the ability through the Kedusha that he would normally obtain by doing mitzvahs. What happens if a man does a sin? Then what happens is the Satan runs up to the Baruch Hashem and accuses the man, and then the Satan says, that Kedusha or that power, that energy is mine. And then the Satan runs down and takes the energy, and then with that energy, he takes the ray gun and he points it at the man and wipes him out. That's essentially how Mishpat operates. It's a battle for the ray gun. In essence, that's what it is. The Baruch Hashem says you have a ray gun and you can destroy your prison. But be very careful, because if you fall, if you fall for the seduction, you will lose the ray gun. But that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is that that ray gun will be pointed at you. And that will be the end of you. That's the concept of mishpat, or conditional olam haba. So that if you sin, you will not earn olam haba. You will be destroyed. So therefore, we see how mishpat exercised its power through the fact that the Satan usurps or absorbs the Kedusha that should have gone to the person. And with that Kedusha, he then goes ahead and he annihilates him. That's the essence where the power of Mishpat comes from. The power of Mishpat to annihilate comes from the same power to create. The same power which could have created Olam Haba is exactly what's used by the Satan to annihilate all existence. You see the exact Midah Keneged Midah, or eye for an eye? When the Baruch Hashem created the world on Mishpat, it was exactly precise. You see, the Baruch Hashem says, I will give you the power, but you have the power to create eternal existence. And if you lose the power, that power will then annihilate and create non-existence. It's exactly Midah Keneged Midah, because that's exactly what the Baruch Hashem wanted. Conditional existence. Whether you survive to Olam Haba or not, whether you survive eternally, is up to you. And it's up to you what happens to that power. But I give you that power and I sit back. That's what God says. I sit back, I'm not interfering with this situation. Here, I'm putting the power into a storage place. And if you do what you tell me, you will have access. If you do the mitzvah, you will have access to the power. If not, then the Satan gets the keys. And with those keys, he performs his job, which I assigned him, which is conditional. And essentially, he performs his task of annihilation. That's how it works. Now, does the Satan need the Kedusha? No. The Satan doesn't need the Kedusha himself. Why? He lives by the Kedusha that the Baruch Hashem gives him, like Baruch Hashem gives to every other Malach. The Baruch Hashem creates Malachim, right? And he gives them a certain amount of Kedusha or power so that they exist. This power that we're talking about is the power of eternal existence that has to do with man. So the Satan gains access to that power or not because he needs it, because that's his job. The Baruch Hashem says that if man relinquishes or abandons that power becomes yours. And with that power, that's how you will do your job. Now what does the Baruch Hashem do? The Baruch Hashem therefore has to do something very, very drastic in order to prevent this process. What does that mean? That means that the Baruch Hashem has to take the ray gun away from the Satan. You see. The Baruch Hashem has to take the ray gun away from the Satan. Because the Satan will take that energy and perform its function of annihilation. So the Baruch Hashem does a very, very strange thing. Very, very strange. Does the Malach have free will? No. Why doesn't the Malach have free will? Because how can you have free choice? Can a Malach go against the Baruch Hashem? No. It's impossible for a Malach to go against God. Why? Because God's presence is all around. There's no hiding it. The power of God's existence is so manifest that who can go against him? Who can defy God? The presence is so absolute that the only thing you want to do is to what? Is to come close to the Baruch Hashem. It's the source of all life, of all existence. Nobody wants to cut himself off from that. A Malach, therefore, is a Kodesh, it's holy, in the sense that a Malach has an exact, absolute perception of the Baruch Hashem. Not in the Baruch Hashem's true nature, but he has a totally clear perception of the Baruch Hashem, of the existence of God, and how he relates to the Baruch Hashem. There is no confusion at all. Only man is given this confusion, because the Baruch Hashem wants man to create his relationship, to determine that, to understand his relationship. That's the free will of man. But a Malach doesn't have free will because it's not his job. There is one Malach who does not recognize the Bnei Shalom. There is one Malach who defies God as a Malach. Now this is strange. How can a Malach defy God? Who is that Malach that defies God? The Satan. The Satan defies God, and you know what happens? The Satan turns around and says to the Bnei Shalom, you think that you will remain king forever? You are mistaken, because I will take over. I will take over, and I will be the God, not you. You ever hear of such chutzpah? Astounding, isn't it? How's that possible? 1 second. What is this happening? What's happening here? Didn't we just say that the Satan is a holy Malach who does the will of God? Right? With respect to man? What is this thing all of a sudden the Satan turns around and says, I will defy you? So we want to know two things. First of all, how is the Satan able to do that? Number one. And number two, why does he do that? All this is connected in what's called lachamim, or mercy. You will begin to understand what it means when we say that God is merciful. What it takes for the Bnei Shalom to be merciful once you establish a world based on mishpat. In order for the Bnei Shalom to what? To prevent the Satan from annihilating mankind with a ray gun and using the energy to destroy, the Bnei Shalom has to transform the Satan into a different kind of Malach. A Malach that never existed before. An aberration of a Malach. What does he do? What he does is the following. Very simply, without going to excessive detail. What he does, he blinds the Malach. And for an instant, he makes that Malach into an evil being. Suddenly the Satan is no longer an angel simply out to do the objective of God, but the Satan now becomes evil. What exactly is an evil being? What is a good being? A being who has goodness in him wants to do good to someone else. He wants to give to someone else. An evil being wants to do evil to someone else. How do you do evil to someone else? You take. You take away from him slowly so that after a while there is nothing left. Good is giving, evil is taking. It's exactly the opposite. An infant is taking, because essentially an infant is based on the consciousness of the Satan. We will get into this some other time, but this is basically what it is. It's only an adult that begins to understand the concept of giving. Maturity involves the ability to give. Immaturity is centered on the process of taking. The difference between a child and an adult is that one is consumed with taking, and the adult is essentially should be consumed with giving. To the extent that an adult is mature, to that extent he can give without suffering a loss himself. And to the extent that he is childish and immature, he's involved or preoccupied with taking and saying, what's in it for me? Or what's good for me? Because the essence of giving and taking is the essence of good and evil. So suddenly the Malach, called the Satan, is involved in taking. He's not doing the job that God gave him. The job of seduction, prosecution, and annihilation is now centered on the aspect of what? Of taking. Now what am I talking about? When the Bnei Shalom first spoke to the Satan and says, you have a job, the job of mishpat, that's a job of giving. It is. Because the Bnei Shalom is saying, it is your job to give to man when he deserves it. If he doesn't deserve it, you're not taking anything away. You're simply not giving him what he hasn't earned. So the original function of the Satan, let's call that function 1. Okay? Function 1 of the Satan, okay, is a job essentially of what? Of giving. It is a giving job. It is the job of the Satan to give man what he has earned. That's his job. If he has not earned it, then he doesn't give it. But not giving it because he hasn't earned it is not the same as taking. The Satan doesn't deal with taking. He deals with giving. But it's conditional. The Satan, number 2, or the second function of the Satan, after God has transformed him, is only to take. What do I mean by taking? What the Satan wants to do is the following. You remember that ray gun? The Satan lives, and then the Satan looks at man and he sees what he does. When man sins, then suddenly the Satan has access to the ray gun. But what the Satan should do as Satan number 1, you see, as the annihilator, he should point the ray gun to man and say, you're annihilated. And then shoot the ray gun, and then when there's a blast coming from the ray gun, the energy is expended, and suddenly man is annihilated. Satan number 2 has the ray gun also. But Satan number 2 says, wait a minute, I don't want to give this energy away to man. I'm not going to waste this energy by annihilating man. I want it. I want it for myself. And if I keep this energy, I feel that in some way it's going to make me into a god. So the Satan suddenly becomes a different type of being. He becomes selfish. He realizes that that energy, which should be used to destroy man, is incredible. That's the power of existence. Because that has the ability to annihilate or create. It's the energy which creates it all in Haba or destroys, annihilates in a Shama. You gotta be crazy to give that away. I want it for myself. So Satan number 2 says, I want the energy. So he runs after the ray gun. Not to kill man, but to keep it himself. Well, in that process, God saves man. If the Banisham in some way can transform the Satan, so that the Satan will take that ray gun or the energy involved and keep it for himself, for whatever reason he has, then that Satan will not use it on man. What will happen is man will be saved from annihilation. Well, the Satan, once he has the power, will go down to punish man, because his job in some way is to punish or to take, so he'll attempt to punish him. But punishing someone is totally different than annihilating him. Totally different. So this is the basic idea. The basic idea is to twist the head of the Satan, so the Satan does not use the energy to destroy, but the energy rather for himself, to build himself up. But the question remains, that sounds great. Sounds like a nice plan, but why would the Satan want to do that? How can you fool the Satan to suddenly take the energy and give it to himself, and that he thinks that he can become a god? I mean, he's an angel. No angel thinks he's going to become a god. Do you see my point? How can you delude the Satan to think that this energy is going to make him to a god, so that now he has the motive to go after the energy himself? You see the basic question. Remember the objective. The Buddhism wants the Satan to take the energy himself and not expend it on annihilation. Why should the Satan take the energy himself? Because in some ways that energy is the energy of existence. And the Satan knows that if he swallows it or absorbs it, he will become eternal. Just like the Buddhism is. And he will take away the malchus of the Buddhism. He will be the king. That's great, but the ultimate question is, why would the Satan want to do it if he's an angel? Angels don't defy God. They listen to the Buddhism. So the whole trick now is to somehow transform the Malach, the Satan, in such a way where he will want to use the energy for himself and not to destroy. How do you do that? Okay? That's the question. But do you see the objective? Do you see the logic? Strange. But you see how it goes? What does the Buddhism do? What the Buddhism does is a certain thing. What he does is he goes out of something and he performs an operation on him and changes his head. What happens is he produces or introduces what's called evil into the Satan. The Satan suddenly no longer has a desire to follow God's will or to do good. But the Satan now, what happens is the Satan thinks in terms of evil, and the Satan sees only evil. That becomes his inner nature. His inner nature is to what? Is to become evil and to take. That's his nature. Once the Satan becomes evil, he can no longer see God. Why? Because what is God? If you observe God in any way possible, or if you can feel His presence, there's only one thing that you feel. You feel absolute good. In the same perception of God's presence, you feel incredible love and goodness. That's what it means to sense God. To sense God is to sense the highest level of Av or love and goodness. It's all in the existence of God. It's built into His power. But if you are a being who is evil, you cannot sense goodness. You see, even when it's all around you. So now that the Satan is inherently evil, and he senses the presence of God, he can't sense the presence of God in its true form. So because of that, God becomes much smaller, and he no longer senses the Buddhism as he is, but through his own glasses, or filtered, he sees now the Buddhism as a much smaller being, you see. Because God's goodness is minimized, hence the existence or the power of God is minimized. Once God is minimized, so to speak, the Satan thinks, wait a minute, he's not as big and powerful as I thought. You see, the reason why the Satan now sees God as a minimal being is because he can't sense the goodness. And because he can't sense the goodness, he cannot sense the power of the Baruch Shalom. Hence he thinks that the Baruch Shalom is smaller than he is, so to speak. Why? Because he senses only evil. The reason, therefore, that the Satan senses this aberration is because of his own problem. It's not that God has become smaller. It's that suddenly, before he was looking at outside what? With a full view, but now suddenly he has what? Blinders on his eyes. So therefore he thinks that the world has become smaller. He thinks that God has become smaller. Do you understand what I'm saying? It is the evil nature of the Satan. When the Baruch Shalom introduced this evil nature, that he's a being that wants to what? Do evil to someone else. Take away. When he introduced this evil aspect into the Satan, that aspect, that inner core now, makes that being unable to feel the true power of God. That's where it all starts from. Since the Satan can no longer feel the true presence of the Baruch Shalom, the Satan now believes that he can what? Take over the Baruch Shalom. Because you have to remember one thing. What is the power of God? The power of God exists in the fact that he is absolutely powerful. And that there's nothing which can exist outside of him, or beside him, or beyond him. That's what makes God God. What makes the Baruch Shalom our God is the fact that he's totally independent. That he doesn't need anything else, and that there's nothing outside of him. No existence is outside of him. That's what makes the Baruch Shalom God. What makes everything in creation subservient to God, that everything in creation feels the fact that in some way he's connected to the Baruch Shalom. That's what makes him a created being. But the Satan no longer responds to that, because now that the Satan feels an inner evil, and he no longer feels the absolute presence of the Baruch Shalom, he now entertains the thought that he is outside of God. Because he doesn't feel any evil in God. There is no evil in the Baruch Shalom, but yet he is evil. Therefore he in some sense is outside of the Baruch Shalom. Well, if he's outside of God, that means God is no longer God in a real sense of the word. If God is no longer God, then it's just only a question of time before he can take over. Voila! Suddenly, we now have him on a new track. Now, his entire purpose is to take over and become king. That's why the Satan is called a Kel Acher, another god. Because the Satan, after the transformation, not before, after the transformation, the Satan now with this evil core believes that the Baruch Shalom does not have the absolute power, but he will have the power. Now the question is, how is he going to get the power? Very simply. Where does the energy of existence lie? Where? It lies in the safe, the ray gun. So the Satan instinctively knows that the only way he will usurp the throne of God is through the ray gun. But how do you get the ray gun? Satan doesn't have access to the ray gun. How can Satan get that ray gun to absorb its energy and then become a God himself and become eternal? One way. Make man sin. If you can get man to sin, you got it, because then that power is yours. So the Satan now looks at that power as his own salvation. He needs that power. He needs that power to what? To fulfill his evil existence. And become what? The Kel Acher instead of God himself. You see this whole scenario. But why is God doing all this? Because then if he uses the power for himself, he will not use the power to destroy mankind. He will only punish mankind with an evil eye. But he will not give away the power that he needs to exist himself eternally. Interesting plot. You see, interesting plot. But this is what's involved in Machavim. You see, the only way the Baruch Shalom can remove the annihilative power is by blinding the Satan in such a way where the Satan will not use that power against mankind. But how do you do that? You do that by making the Satan what? Desirous of the power himself. But why should the Satan want this power? He would want this power because he would want the power of eternity. But why would the Satan want the power of eternity? The Satan wants the power of eternity so that he can establish himself as an eternal being, as a God, and defy the Baruch Shalom. But how can a Malach defy the Baruch Shalom? Because the Baruch Shalom introduces an evil component into his nature, so that he no longer can see the Baruch Shalom clearly. Hence he thinks that in some way he is outside of him, or separate from God. Now we have the entire scenario. You see how it goes step by step? This is what's involved. So therefore, the essence of Rachamim lies in the transformation of the Satan himself. The Buddhism cannot be Kavayochel Rachamim, a Malachim, if he doesn't transform the Satan, who is the agent of Din and the agent of annihilation. This is what's happening. Now we see something else. The Satan no longer simply says to man, I want to seduce you because God told me to go seduce you and see to it whether or not you go into Olam Haba. The Satan wants to seduce you because he needs your energy. So therefore, you are at war with the Satan. Whereas before, the Satan was simply the agent of God. Now the Satan is out for himself. And the Satan wants that Kedusha of himself. So now man and the Satan are at war. Because both realize that only one can come out alive out of this arena. It's like the Roman gladiators. You see, only one guy can come out. Either the Satan comes out or man comes out. And they both run after the same light. That's what's been established. But this war between man and the Satan is necessary. Because if man was not involved in a war with the Satan, then the Satan would take that energy and destroy him through his sins. So what the Banishim does is take the energy and give it to the Satan, so that the Satan will use it for himself. The war is necessary for man to survive. Because if there's no war, then man loses. This is the basic idea. That's really the way we relate to the Satan. Satan number 2. Satan number 1 is a wonderful malach. Satan number 1 is simply a person who simply did his job, a nice employee, with benefits and everything. He's a nice guy. He simply says, okay, I'll be a seducer, I'll be a prosecutor, I'll be an annihilator. That's all, I'll do what you tell me. Satan number 2 is an entirely different being. Now, when did Satan number 1 become Satan number 2? When? That's the question. Obviously, Satan number 1 became Satan number 2 only when it became necessary. Why did Satan number 1 become Satan number 2? Satan number 1 becomes Satan number 2. Why? So that he doesn't destroy mankind. When would the Satan want to destroy mankind? If man sins. So therefore, at the moment that Adam Rishon sinned, suddenly Satan number 1 became Satan number 2. That's when it happened. It was built in. And the Banishim built this at the beginning of creation. The Banishim knew that if man would sin, he would create the mechanism where the Satan would instantly transform to prevent Mishpat from acting out. So Satan number 1 will no longer act out Mishpat. It therefore was Adam's sin. The sin of Adam transformed the Satan. What did Adam Rishon do to the Satan? He took a wonderfully, normally healthy malach and he disfigured his face. Adam Rishon did that. He grabbed the malach by his head and shoved his head into the dirt. The sin of Adam did that. He defiled the Satan. You say the Banishim did it. No. The Banishim didn't do it. The Banishim did it to save man. But it's man that did it. The Banishim simply responded with the consequence of Adam's evil deeds. You see. That's what the Banishim did, Kaviyachal, to save him. But it's the sin of Adam which transformed the Satan. It's the sin of Adam which took a wonderful malach and disfigured him. So that he's an ugly malach who is bent on evil and on what? On self-perpetuation. That's what he did. So therefore, one of the things that Adam Rishon have to do is to atone for the fact of what he did to the malach. That's what it means when God cursed the Nachash. When it says that God cursed the Nachash, it doesn't mean he actually cursed the Nachash because the Nachash did something wrong. The Nachash didn't do anything wrong. The Nachash did his job. But the curse of the Nachash symbolizes the transformation of the Satan. When the Banishim said to the Nachash, I will take your feet off and you will crawl on your belly. When the Banishim did it, what does that mean, I will take your feet and crawl on your belly? What the Banishim said is, no longer will you be able to look up, but you will look down. No longer will you be a normal malach and look up and see the existence of God, but you will look down into the earth. You will only see what? Physicality, or you will only see evil, or you will only see the ability to defy God. You will no longer be able to see the emes, because your mind will be consumed with sheker. You will have no feet. You will not be able to stand anymore. You will be part of the ground, a part of the earth, part of the hester, part of the concealment, because the concealment would enter into you, the malach itself. The Banishim said to the Satan, you will be at war with man. Now we understand why. Why is the Nachash at war? Why is it that man and the serpent are what? Mortal enemies. Because it represents now the new figure of the Satan, Satan number 2, who is now at war with man. Satan number 2 is the total adversary of man. Satan number 1 was simply the agent of God. Satan number 2 is the adversary of man. It's a different situation, because they both now are after the same power. So therefore the Rebbeinu Shem cursed the Nachash and said, you will be at war with man, meaning that it is your function. I am going to transform your personality, and you will now be at war, because you will now feel the need to exist yourself. You will feel a deep-seated insecurity in your own existence, and you will feel the need to rebel to me, you see, to rebel against me. And you will understand that your rebellion against me can succeed only if you take the Kedusha of man, the ray gun. That essentially therefore is the curse of the Nachash. It's not a real curse. When the Rebbeinu Shem cursed the Nachash, he simply was telling us in the Torah what he did to the Satan, who was the what? Who is represented in the Nachash. And we know now what the reason was. Why did the Rebbeinu Shem do that? He did it so to save man. When did the Rebbeinu Shem transform the Nachash? At the sin of Adam. Why? To save Adam. And that's essentially the entire purpose here. This entire understanding that we have is at tremendous odds with Christianity. You see, because the Christians understand something about this. Strangely enough. They strangely enough understand something about this. Because according to the Christians, what they say basically is that there is God, and that there's something called, who is represented by Jesus, by Christ, and there's something called the Antichrist, or Lucifer. I don't know if you've ever heard the terms. The Christians believe that the devil fights against God, and wants to dethrone God. Have you ever heard the poem by Milton, where Beelzebub says in Paradise Lost, or Gained, I forget which one, where he says, it is better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. What is the Satan saying? It's saying that it's better to be a king in hell than to be a servant for God, because I want to rebel against the Rebbeinu Shem. That is the essential Christian concept, that there's something called the Antichrist or Lucifer, whose sole function is to defy God and try and win God. Now Lucifer loses in the end. Why? Because God is stronger. That's why. God is stronger than Lucifer, according to the Christians. Because God is still God. But Lucifer is still strong, and Lucifer does want to rebel against God. You see. Except that he loses. So Lucifer and God are adversaries. The Christ and the Antichrist are adversaries. Real adversaries. And they see these two as two separate beings at war with each other, except that God wins in the end. But the whole thing's a shtus, which they don't understand. It is true that the Satan is at war with God. It is. But the Satan is not at war with God because he really, in any sense, is a true adversary of God. The Satan is at war with God because the Rebbeinu Shem made him to be an adversary. Because that fits his purpose. You see the difference between... That's the difference between the way the Torah says, the way the Christians understand it. The Christians are distorted and they don't understand what they see. The Satan defies God because that's his tachlis. That's his purpose. And by defying the Rebbeinu Shem, by thinking that he can be a God, by taking the energy from himself, he saves man. That's how the Rebbeinu Shem saves man. So what we see is the most incredible thing which Christians cannot understand. That the way the Rebbeinu Shem brings absolute good is by creating absolute evil. Evil is created because evil serves good. That is a bizarre concept in any other religion. Because in all religions there's something called good and there's something called evil. They're both contradicting forces, and good is stronger, so good will overcome evil. Judaism doesn't see this at all. There's no such thing as good and evil as adversarial forces. There is only good. That's all. There's only chesed. And there's what's called din, which is conditional good. And when din attempts to annihilate existence, then the Rebbeinu Shem introduces something called evil. But evil exists so that ultimately chesed will remain. You see, evil serves the purpose of good. It doesn't exist to defy or to go against good. It's not an antagonist. It is an agent of good. Which means that the Rebbeinu Shem employs evil to bring good. Only the Rebbeinu Shem can do this. And that's what we mean by Hashem Echad. That there is one God. That's the inner meaning of Hashem Echad. What do you mean one God? There's only one God who reigns over good and evil. There's not two different gods or two forces. There's only one Rebbeinu Shalom, you see. And everything which emanates him is what ultimately goes back to his ultimate purpose. What's the ultimate purpose of the Baruch Shalom? To be beneficent, to do good. That means that everything that the Baruch Shalom performs in some way fulfills that objective of ultimate good. Even evil. Because evil is just another force designed to bring out ultimate beneficence. Hashem Echad, there's only one Baruch Shalom. You see, just like you make a bracha, just like what he calls the Baruch Shalom is sholet, controls the good, he's sholet or he controls the evil. Both of them are subservient to the ultimate good. There is no such thing as evil in the world as we see it. You see, this is a very, very critical concept. And this is what you see. You see this in its height, in its greatest fashion, by the transformation of the Satan. That the transformation of the Satan shows us what really the function and purpose of evil is. This, then, is the job of the Mashiach ben Yosef. Because the Mashiach ben Yosef understands it clearly, you see. When he looks at the Satan, he doesn't necessarily see an adversary. He sees someone who is sick. The Satan needs a refuah shlema. Because the Satan has to go from number 2 back to number 1. That's the point. Satan number 1 is the Nachash, the agent of God. Satan number 2 is the Zom of the Nachash, the adversary of God, who fulfills Rachamim. The function of the Mashiach ben Yosef is to remove the Zoma, or Satan number 2, and allow Satan number 1 to come back. And then the Mashiach ben David comes along and removes the number 1. So the Mashiach ben Yosef, therefore, is the individual who will bring a refuah shalema to the Satan himself. He will restore him back to the Malach that he was before. So the Malach, suddenly, the blindness of the Malach, or the capacity of the Malach only to see evil, will be removed. And as soon as that's taken away, suddenly the Malach will awake and say, my God, I was like in a dream, and it's like, wait a minute, there's a voice from here. What's going on? Because as soon as the glass, the evil glass or the evil filter is removed, suddenly the full presence of God is again recognized, and the presence of God is ultimate good. And the Satan will not think of himself as a separate being, you see, who's outside of God, as evil is outside of good. That's what we all hope for. When we say that the Baruch cures the Jews, what it means, he not only cures or brings a refuah to the Jews in terms of what? The Zoma which exists in them. But even more fundamentally, the Baruch brings a refuah to the Satan himself, to the Zoyama itself he brings a refuah. Because the function of the Zoyama itself is simply to bring the ultimate good. That's why there is a Zoyama. I want you to know, what we're speaking tonight is among the deepest parts of Hashkafa, you see. And I'm not even going into what's involved in it, really. This is the outer things. This is the outer tip of the iceberg, you see. Because the question is, what does it mean that the Baruch made the Satan evil? What does that mean? Yeah. These are very, very deep things. It is impossible to explore this, to explain this at this point in time, what that nature is, you see. But what I'm simply trying to do is giving you the characterization of the Satan and the distinction between the different levels of transformation and the objective, why the Baruch did it, you see. But to ultimately understand the inner processes is extraordinarily difficult. But that's what we see. Do we see it? Every time you say that God is merciful, you will never again say it in a simple way. Because you will begin to understand for the first time what it means for God to be merciful. You see, there's no simple thing that says, okay, I forgive you. It's not that simple, because the Baruch first says it's conditional. Once you say that Olam Haba is conditional, you can't simply say I forgive you. It doesn't work that, and you can go to Olam Haba, forget about it, it's alright, I'm with you, you can go to Olam Haba. You can't do that, you see. Because once you create a system one way, then in order to deal with that system, you've got to deal with different aspects of it so that it works within the system. Mercy must work within Mishpat. Mercy is not what? Outside of the system. Mercy doesn't rebel against Mishpat. The God of Mishpat, the God of justice, is not opposite the God of mercy. They're not two opposite beings. But fundamentally they are opposite concepts. How is it possible? So the Baruch has to reconcile these two with an entire intricate mechanism in terms of tampering with the original process of Mishpat. The Baruch tampers with that. And as he tampers with that in such a way, you see, he allows it to what? To occur, but in a certain hidden way. Now the amazing thing is that all the time this is going on, the Satan is not aware of this. The Satan doesn't know this. You see? And let me finish off here with the ultimate concept here. Now that I'm on to this. Why? The Satan himself does not know that he is involved in this process. He doesn't know it all. That's why you find a very strange thing. Now listen carefully and we'll expand this into its ultimate conclusion. What is the function of the Satan? The function of the Satan, number one, is to go over to a tzaddik, a man who is righteous, and try and make him sin. You see, that's his function. To go over to someone who's a tzaddik and make him into a rasha. That's his job, if he can do it. Therefore, the function of Satan number one is to attempt to seduce righteous people. Satan number two has the opposite function. He goes over someone who is evil, or someone who sinned, and he makes him again righteous. How? Because instead of annihilating him, he goes down to punish him. And as he punishes him, the man then becomes what? Pure, and he becomes righteous. So Satan number one makes the righteous into the sinful, and Satan number two, unbeknownst to him, he doesn't know it. You see? When he goes down to punish the man, he thinks that he's doing his evil job. But at the same time, he's really purifying it. The man. He's taking away the effects of the evil. So his job is really to take someone who has sinned and make him into a righteous being again. That's Satan number two. So Satan number one has the opposite job of Satan number two. But fundamentally, they still remain both the same being. They are. Except Satan number one is on the inside, and Satan number two is on the outside. That's what it's really like. It's a Jekyll and Hyde personality. The guy is a multiple personality. That's really what he is. Both exist at the same time, except that each doesn't know about the other. I don't know if you've ever heard of a multiple personality, but there are certain types of individuals that's very rare, you see. I'm not talking about a moody personality. I'm talking about a multiple personality. It's a whole different concept. You see, multiple personality is a person who has developed two different personalities entirely. Either one generally not being aware of the other. That's what the Satan is. He's a being with a multiple personality, and he doesn't know, either side does not know the function. You see. And what happens is that one side does one job, and the other side does the other job. Now normally, in all of creation, this does not exist. In all of creation, it's impossible. For example, if you were in a court of law, can the defense attorney become a prosecuting attorney? Can a prosecuting attorney become a defense attorney? Of course not. You gotta have two different lawyers. You can't perform the function of prosecution at the same time as the function of defense. They're opposite processes. The Talmud says this very distinctly. Ein sanega or ein katega nase sanega. A prosecutor cannot be a defense attorney. It's simple. You can't take the same being who is trained to do one thing to do the other. The Satan by his nature is the only one who is the exception to the rule in all of existence. In all of existence, there are malachim who are pro and there are malachim who are con. But there's basically one malach, essentially, who does both at the same time as a multiple personality, and he doesn't know it. He's the only one in all existence who does two opposite things at the same time. Now the Satan himself doesn't know it. He doesn't know it at all. Now, there is one mitzvah in the Torah which symbolizes this thing. There's one mitzvah that was given in the Torah which symbolizes one thing doing two opposites. Who knows what that is? The Parah Aduma. The Parah Aduma is called the red heifer. Okay, what they used to do with the Parah Aduma, they used to sacrifice it, burn it up for ashes, and take the ashes and mix it with certain type of water. They would take that water and sprinkle it on a man who became impure, defiled, because he came in contact with a dead body. The law is that if you come in contact with a dead body, either by touching or entering into the same room, you become spiritually defiled. And it's a very powerful form of defilement. The only way to remove that defilement is through the ashes of the Parah Aduma, called the Mechatas, the waters of the Parah Aduma. You see. But that water is very strange. If you take that water, right? If you take that water and you sprinkle it on a man who is impure, he suddenly becomes pure. If you take the same water and you sprinkle it on a man who's pure, he becomes impure. Hey, wait a minute. 1 second. How do you do both at the same time? Make up your mind. How can the same water purify and contaminate? That's what it does. The answer? There is no answer. The Torah says that this is the greatest chok in the entire Torah. There are two types of mitzvahs. There are certain mitzvahs which we know the reason, or at least we think we do, and there are other mitzvahs which we have no idea at all. Like, for example, many laws of kashrus. We don't know the real reason why we're not supposed to eat kosher things. Many things, shatnez, you can't put wool and linen together. We don't know why. Most of the laws of Torah, we don't know why they exist this way. But the Baruch says, these you must do because I say it. These are called chukim. A chuk is a statute. And a statute is a commandment which no reason was given. A mishpat is a commandment which we understand the reasons, like thou shalt not kill. We understand why you're not supposed to kill, or else there won't be any civilization. You see, but why somebody can't eat a kaza, or why someone can't eat meat and milk together, is not understood. The greatest of all hukum, or the greatest of all statutes, or the greatest of all undefined mitzvahs is the paraduma. Why is it the greatest one of all? Because not only is it not understood, it is contradictory. All the other statutes are simply not understood. We don't understand what it is, but they're not contradictory. But the Torah Duma is not only not understood, we don't understand why water, when you sprinkle it, purifies someone, but even more than that, it is an internal self-contradiction. How can the same water purify and contaminate at the same time? That's what the Banishim says. Now if you look in the Parsha in the Torah, Chukas, which talks about the Torah Duma, Rashi comes down and says that the Satan, or the Satan comes over to the Banishim, the Satan and all the nations of the world, and they laugh. The Satan looks at this mitzvah and says, this mitzvah is ridiculous. It's a contradiction. How can the same thing do two opposite things at the same time? That's what it says. That the Satan, the angel of the Satan, and the nations of the world, the Goyim, laugh at the Paraduma. Because the Paraduma is the most mysterious of all. And the Satan himself says it's ridiculous. Now the question is, how can the Satan laugh at something in the Torah? The Satan is a malach. Doesn't the Satan know the reasons for these things? Satan number 1 does, but Satan number 2 does not. Why? Because the Torah Duma exemplifies the exact process that he is doing and is not aware of. Just like the Torah Duma does two opposite things at the same time. Yes. You see? So he does. Now he laughs at the Torah Duma because he doesn't understand it. Because he's doing the same job. This is the point. That's the concept. That the Satan is essentially a multiple personality. And in his logic, it's impossible to understand how you can do the two opposite functions. How can you make a tzaddik into a rasha and a rasha into a tzaddik from the same person, the same being? It's impossible. But that's the function. That is the function, you see, of the Satan in its transformation. Do we understand this? That's why the Satan laughs at it. He has to laugh at it because he cannot know what he's doing. Now let's get on to one more thing and we'll understand something very interesting. There's a very strange medrash, and you can now understand it beautifully. There's a very strange medrash where the 10 martyrs are all dying, and what happens is the first 2 martyrs were taken by the Romans, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol. And they were both going and so on, and they were both destined to die. They were among 2 of the first 10 martyrs. And then what happened is they took Rabbi Shmuel and they started to kill him. And what happened is the Romans took a knife and they started to cut his head. And when the knife hit the makam, the place of the tefillin, the soul of Rabbi Shmuel screamed out a tremendous shout in all of the heavens. So the malachim all turned to God and said, how is this possible? Zu Torah v'Zchora? Is this Torah and this is its reward? How can a man who is such an incredible tzaddik, such an incredible holy person, suffer such an agonizing death by the hands of the Romans? That's what the malachim said. So the Bonishim said, it is my decree. It is a decree from before me. He didn't explain to them. He said, that's my decree. My decree always means Anogat HaYichud. You see. So then the Sultans were still asking. Well, we still don't understand. So the Bonisham says, if you ask me one more time, I will completely reduce the world back to null and void the way it was before I created it. If you persist in your questioning. That's the medrash. Now that's a very strange medrash. Because what does the Bonisham want? The Malachim asked the Bonisham a question. You're entitled to ask a question. We don't understand what's going on down here. So the Bonisham says, that's the way I have to run my world. The Malachim want to ask again. What did the Bonisham do? He threatened them. He said, if I hear one more word out of your mouth, I'm going to reduce everything to what? To Tohu Vavohu. What kind of threat is that? The Bonisham should simply say, I don't want to answer you. You see, because they asked the question, they're threatened with their existence. Very bizarre medrash. But now we can understand this medrash very well. The Bonisham wasn't threatening their existence at all. The Bonisham was very simply saying this, You want to understand why Rabbi Shmuel is dying? You want to understand why such a tzaddik is suffering that kind of a death? He said, I cannot tell you, it's for my mysteries. They kept on persisting. So the Rebbeinu Shem said to them, if you want to understand how and why I have to use Rabbi Shmuel to do this, then I will reveal to you the process of Rachamim. If I reveal the process of Rachamim to you, then it would automatically also be revealed to who? To the Satan. Once he understands it, then transformation number 2 disappears. And then he becomes transformation number 1. Well, what's the job of Satan number 1? To destroy the world. Based on sin. So what the Rebbeinu said is, if I explain it to you, then I will destroy the mechanism of mercy itself. And if I destroy the mechanism of mercy itself, then justice will rule. If justice rules, the world is restored back to Tohu Vavohu. Do we understand this medrash? You see how it totally changed a whole different concept. Now that we understand the inner depth of this, the medrash means entirely different. But that's what the Rebbeinu was saying to the Malachim. It's not that I don't want to tell you or threaten you, but I cannot reveal this to you. Because the success of this method, the success of my mercy, lies in its disguise. It lies in the fact that it's concealed. As long as it's concealed, it'll work. Once it's revealed, it will not work anymore. Why? Because in essence, the whole concept of mercy lies in a contradiction. It lies in the same being, doing two opposite things at the same time. That's the way I'm able to do it. It lies in the highest form of contradiction. That's why the Por Duma is the highest of all chukim, and nobody ever knew the underlying concept of the Por Duma except for Moshe Rabbeinu. He is the only one. Even Shlomo Melech, it said, King Solomon, who is the wisest of all men, tried to understand the Por Duma, and he failed. Only Moshe Rabbeinu understood the Por Duma. Only Moshe Rabbeinu. And there's a reason why. Even Moshe would not have understood it. But Moshe understood the Por Duma because Moshe went up to the Shemayim to bring down the light of the Mashiach. The explanation of the Por Duma is in the light of the Mashiach. Why? Why is it that once you arrive at the light of the Mashiach, you can understand the Por Duma? Very simple. Because once the Mashiach arrives, there is no more Zohar. Because the function of the Mashiach is to destroy the contradiction. To destroy Satan number 2. Once Satan number 2 is destroyed, then everyone could know the secret of Por Duma. Because it doesn't matter that everyone knows it. You see what I'm saying? That's the whole thing. That's why when the Mashiach arrives, everybody will know what Solomon couldn't understand. Why didn't Solomon understand it? Solomon couldn't understand it because it was needed. It was working at that time. It was in the process of operation. As long as the process of the Por Duma is taking place, nobody can understand how it works. Because to understand how it works is to completely destroy the possibility of its success. But once it's no longer necessary, once the Mashiach arrives, and there's a Tahara, there is no more Domo, Satan number 2 is cured, transformed back, then any small child can understand the principle of the Por Duma. That which the Satan could not have understood, now could be understood by any infant. It's a question of timing, not a question so much of intelligence. The question is, when the Satan takes the koyach, I want to just finish off with this one thing without really explaining it, but when the Satan takes this energy, which belongs to man, which man can use as vichoch, and he takes the energy to become eternal, what happens? Is it true that he can become eternal? The answer is no. He cannot become eternal. The truth of the matter is that as he accumulates the energy, he begins to be destroyed as well. You see, he begins to literally disappear as well. Because the Satan himself is also an internal contradiction. The more he wants to survive, the closer to extinction he becomes. Closer to extinction he becomes. To extinct he becomes. It's exactly that word. Why that is has to do with a different kind of concept. But he can never succeed. He can never succeed. You see, he can never succeed because he can never dethrone God. That's an impossibility. He thinks he can dethrone God. It's an illusion. He thinks that if he takes the power of man, he can dethrone God. But you have to remember, it's an illusion which exists because he's evil. But just because he's evil doesn't mean that he's really doing it. Even if he had the full power of man, he still wouldn't become God. It's an illusion. So therefore, it's something which could never be. But it's more than an illusion. As he accumulates the power of man, it begins to focus on him and destroy him as well. There's no way for him to get around it. I don't want to go into the concept, but that's the built-in aspect of this entire system, you see. The built-in aspect of this entire system is also the fact that as he succeeds in seducing man, he also destroys himself in the process. It's suicide. He sees it as becoming eternal, but the truth of the matter is, it really is suicide at the same time. Why that is a whole different cheer, and it's really not on this level. But it's a suicidal process that he's in. And that basically ends this understanding, but I think we have a much deeper understanding of what it takes for the Bnei Shem Kav Yochel to be a malachim, to be merciful, number one, and what really the sin of Adam did, and what the Mashiach will have to undo. And the fact is that the one that we have to ask Mechila the most, the one that we have to ask forgiveness the most, is the Satan himself. You see, that's the strange thing. All of us are busy hating the Satan because he's seducing us and doing God knows what to us. But the fact of the matter is that we have hurt him very, very seriously. We have really damaged him, you see. And what we have to do is give him a refuah shlema, just like we need it.